You think Spartans were the ultimate warriors of discipline and honor. The men of 300 who shouted, "This is Sparta," before kicking enemies into the abyss? Reality check. The same society that worshipped strength also practiced some of the most humiliating, disturbing, and downright bizarre execution methods the ancient world ever saw. Forget noble duels or heroic deaths. Sparta's punishments looked more like twisted reality TV torture than honorable justice. Adulterers drowned in wine barrels, traitors forced to run through gauntlets of whips until their flesh peeled, and in one infamous case, the Spartans turned an entire execution into a public theater of shame, something so absurd it makes today's cancel culture look like kindergarten timeout. And here's the kicker. These punishments weren't just about killing. They were about breaking you first, mind, body, reputation, before finally erasing you. In this exposé, we're going to peel back the polished bronze helmet of Spartan mythology. We'll move step by step through escalating horrors, each chapter revealing a deeper level of cruelty and hypocrisy. By the end, you'll never look at Spartan discipline the same way again. Welcome to the bizarre execution methods of the Spartans, where strength was worshipped, weakness was destroyed, and punishment was an art form. You've been lied to about Sparta. For decades, Hollywood and pop culture have sold us the polished bronze fantasy, chiseled warriors, flawless discipline, men who lived and died for honor. The ultimate alpha civilization carved into the stone of history as if perfection itself wore a crimson cloak. But behind the legend, a society less like a band of noble warriors and more like a suffocating police state, where conformity was demanded and disobedience was not just punished, it was erased. Sparta wasn't built on freedom. It was built on fear. From birth, a Spartan child's worth was measured in muscle and symmetry. Deformed, weak, the elders inspected the infant like livestock, and if the baby didn't meet the standard, it was cast away into the chasm of Mount Taygetus. Not an act of mercy, an act of cleansing. Strength was worshipped, weakness annihilated, and that ritual sacrifice of babies became the foundation for everything else Sparta believed in. As they grew, the people of Sparta were bound by rules so suffocating it makes modern authoritarian states look relaxed. Men were stripped from their families and thrown into the agoge, the brutal military training system that prized obedience above life itself. Women were told their only value was producing more sons to feed the machine. Helots, the enslaved population, lived in constant terror, not only forced into servitude, but subjected to an annual declaration of war by their Spartan overlords. That's right. Every year, Sparta made it officially legal to slaughter their slaves at will. And the laws? Forget debate. Forget dissent. This was not Athens with its noisy assemblies and philosophers arguing about justice. In Sparta, questioning the state was treason. Treason wasn't a word in a courtroom, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. Even kings were not immune. They could be accused, tried, and executed if they dared step outside the rigid code of the city. So the myth of Spartan honor hides a darker truth. This was not a society of free men bravely living for virtue. It was a machine, efficient, merciless, and obsessed with control. Imagine living in a world where the wrong step, the wrong word, or even the wrong facial expression could brand you a coward, a traitor, a disgrace. And disgrace in Sparta was worse than death. Because here's the chilling twist. Execution in Sparta wasn't just about ending life. No, the Spartans turned death itself into ritualistic theater. The condemned weren't killed cleanly, swiftly, or silently. Their deaths were spectacles, staged, ironic, and often grotesque performances designed to teach everyone else what happens when you fall out of line. And those performances were about to get far darker than anything Hollywood ever dared to show. Because the punishments of Sparta weren't just brutal. They were absurd, humiliating, and horrifyingly creative. And once you see how they killed, you'll never look at their so-called discipline the same way again. Cowardice. In most societies it meant shame. In Sparta, it meant living death. The Spartans did not just punish weakness, they weaponized humiliation, transforming it into something far worse than a sword through the gut. To die swiftly was merciful. To be mocked, paraded, and stripped of dignity before being destroyed, that was the Spartan specialty. Consider the man who lost his shield in battle. To us it might seem trivial. What's a shield compared to a sword? But in Sparta, losing your shield was the ultimate disgrace. The shield didn't just protect you, it protected the man beside you. Dropping it wasn't just cowardice, it was betrayal. And betrayal demanded a punishment more creative than mere death. Such men were dressed in women's clothing and paraded through the streets, mocked by children and spat on by neighbors. It was a ritual of laughter and cruelty, designed to strip away every last shred of manhood before the inevitable end. Adulterers faced similar cruelty. In a society if discipline was prized above all else, breaking the sacred bonds of Spartan marriage wasn't seen as passion, it was seen as corruption. Some adulterers were paraded naked, their bodies smeared with filth, while crowds hurled insults. Others were forced to perform degrading tasks, serving at banquets as living symbols of disgrace, mocked by the very people who once respected them. Imagine today if your punishment for infidelity wasn't divorce or court, but being transformed into the town clown, forced to wear a costume of shame before the final blow was struck. That was Spartan justice. Humiliation first, death second. And the cruelty wasn't reserved only for criminals. It extended even to those who had simply failed. Soldiers who survived a battle by retreating were branded with permanent dishonor. They weren't executed immediately. No, that would be too easy. Instead, they were made into examples. Forbidden from holding public office, excluded from the common mess halls, ridiculed in markets, mocked in songs. Their lives became long executions, drawn out over years, until the weight of shame drove many to suicide. Spartan society didn't just kill its cowards, it made them beg for death. Perhaps the darkest part of all was how humiliation was woven into the very fabric of control. Helots, the enslaved population, were often forced into roles designed to degrade them in front of their Spartan masters. At public feasts, helots were made to drink excessive amounts of wine until they staggered and vomited, living cautionary tales of drunkenness, mocked and laughed at by Spartan youth. The message was simple: this is what happens when you lack discipline, your body, your dignity, your life. It can all be twisted into theater for the crowd. What made this humiliation so effective was its permanence. Spartan punishments didn't just end with the victim's death. Their disgrace was carried forward in memory, etched into songs and stories, passed down as warnings. Honor was everything in Sparta. And so dishonor, especially public ritualized dishonor, was a fate worse than death itself. Think about that for a moment. A Spartan would rather bleed out on the battlefield than survive to be mocked by his own people. Death was clean. Death was honorable. But humiliation? Humiliation was a slow poison, eating away at reputation, identity, and soul. It was a punishment not just for the body, but for the very idea of who you were. And yet, as cruel as this theater of shame was, it was only the beginning. Because when humiliation wasn't enough, the Spartans had something even darker up their sleeves. Something that didn't just break your spirit, it tore your flesh apart. Because in Sparta, when shame lost its sting, the whip was waiting. Picture this: a boy, barely a teenager, stripped to the waist, his skin already raw from lashes. Around him a crowd gathers, not to stop it, not to save him, but to cheer. Each strike cuts deeper, blood spraying, his knees buckling, but he cannot scream. To cry out is weakness. To collapse is shame. And so he endures, until the whip takes what's left of his life. The spectators roar, not in horror, but in admiration. In Sparta, death by flogging wasn't tragedy, it was theatre. The roots of this cruelty go back to the agoge, the infamous Spartan training system. Boys were taught early that pain was not just a test, but a way of life. At the shrine of Artemis Orthia, they were whipped as part of a sacred ritual. But ritual is too clean a word. This was a blood sport. The lash tore into young bodies while parents and priests watched. Boys who collapsed were mocked. Boys who died were celebrated as martyrs of discipline. Imagine sending your child into a school where graduation required surviving torture. That was Sparta's idea of education. And this obsession with the whip didn't stop at childhood. For adults accused of crimes, thieves, traitors, or even those who simply failed the state, the punishment was a public gauntlet. The condemned were stripped, tied, and forced to endure lashes under the gaze of the entire community. The whip wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. Every crack across the skin said, "This is what happens if you stray from obedience." Flesh shredded, bones exposed, death inch by inch, as the crowd bore witness. Some might think, surely, the purpose was to end the victim quickly. But no, the Spartans weren't interested in efficiency. They were interested in endurance. Victims were made to last as long as possible. Their suffering extended for hours. It wasn't about punishment, it was about spectacle. The body became a canvas of torn skin, and the crowd was the jury, reveling in the grotesque display of order being restored. And here's the disturbing part. Even those who didn't die were forever marked. Survivors of public flogging carried scars so deep, they were like living warnings etched into their flesh. Their backs became walking billboards for obedience, reminders to everyone else that the whip was never far away. Imagine a society where scars weren't a mark of bravery, but of public disgrace, visible proof that the state had broken you. But the cruelty didn't stop with the accused. Sometimes, the spectacle claimed lives that were supposed to be safe. At Artemis, Orthia, boys died regularly in what was officially a festival. The state didn't flinch. To them, these deaths weren't accidents. They were proof of discipline. A young life ended was a small price to pay for reinforcing the message. Obedience is survival. Disobedience is agony. This wasn't justice. It wasn't even punishment. It was control through horror, institutionalized sadism, disguised as tradition. And when you peel back the layers, it looks uncomfortably familiar. Think of modern regimes that use public beatings, forced confessions, and televised executions to remind people who holds the power. The methods may have changed, but the message remains the same. Fear works best when it's performed in front of an audience. The whip was Sparta's stage, and the condemned were its unwilling actors. Every lash was a reminder that life here wasn't about freedom, it was about submission. And if you failed to submit, the whip would strip away your dignity, your body, and your life, one crack at a time. But in Sparta, sometimes even the whip wasn't the end, because once you were dead, your suffering didn't stop. Sometimes they didn't even let you die with dignity. They turned your corpse into the final act of the spectacle. A man stands before a vat, not of water, not of oil, but of dark, swirling wine. The very drink the Greeks praised as a gift of the gods, turned here into a scarlet tomb. He's bound, gagged, forced closer, until the stench of ferment fills his lungs. And then he's pushed under. The liquid floods his nose, his throat burns, and the crowd watches as he thrashes. The surface ripples, bubbles, and then stills, death by drowning, but not in water. In Sparta, it was wine that killed you. Why wine? For a people who prided themselves on their iron discipline, their austerity, their contempt for drunkenness, this punishment was more than execution. It was irony turned lethal. Sparta feared excess. To be drunk was to be weak, to stumble, to lose control. So they made intoxication itself a weapon. If you betrayed Sparta through adultery, corruption, or treachery, your body would be drowned in the very symbol of indulgence. It was poetic justice, written in liquid form. Imagine the spectacle, a condemned official accused of accepting bribes, shoved into a vat of the very luxury he was said to have chased. The wine stains his skin, fills his lungs, smothers him in the excess he embraced. To the crowd, it wasn't just an execution, it was a moral performance, a public sermon without words. The message was clear. In Sparta, the pleasures you chase will be the pleasures that kill you. The cruelty didn't stop at the act itself. This wasn't a quiet execution in the shadows. The drowning was staged for maximum humiliation. Spectators mocked the gasping victim, sometimes forcing his head above the surface just long enough to spit in his face before plunging him back into the dark. Death came slow, in choking bursts. His body jerked, his lungs filled, until the final silence confirmed that discipline had been restored. There's something almost absurd in it, isn't there? The same society that banned drunkenness, that mocked other Greeks for their love of wine, chose to weaponize that very drink as a tool of death. It's like forcing a health fanatic to overdose on junk food, or a modern teetotaler to drown in vodka. It wasn't just execution, it was irony sharpened into a blade. And it had an added effect. It kept the community complicit. Because watching someone drown in wine wasn't just about punishment, it was about reinforcing the collective fear of excess. Spartans learned early that indulgence, corruption, or any slip toward pleasure would not simply bring shame, it would bring death, personalized in the cruelest way possible. But here's where it becomes darker still. This wasn't limited to corrupt officials. Stories suggest adulterers, thieves, even slaves accused of mocking Spartan customs could meet the same fate. A vat of wine became a grave, a stage, and a warning all at once. The liquid that once symbolized celebration and unity, communal drinking at festivals, became the medium of suffocation and silence. Think about that duality. What other culture turned its feast into its funeral, where one man toasted to victory with wine, another drowned in it for his disgrace? In Sparta, there was no safe boundary between joy and terror. The very things that bound the community together could just as easily destroy you. And if drowning a man in wine seems grotesque, remember, this was still Sparta. Death was never the full story. Sometimes the execution wasn't just about what you drank or what you drowned in, it was about who you offended. And when the gods themselves were the ones you angered, your punishment left the realm of men entirely. Because if drowning was for mortals, the next level of cruelty was sacrifice to the divine. The temple doors close with a heavy thud. Inside, the air is still suffocating. A man paces in the dark, the weight of stone pressing in on him. He is no common thief or coward. He is a general, once hailed as a hero of Sparta. His name Pausanias, the same man who had commanded at Plataea, crushing the Persians in one of Greece's greatest victories. But glory has a short half-life in Sparta. Accused of treason, of conspiring with the enemy, Pausanias is not granted a trial, he is not granted a clean death. Instead, he is walled inside the temple of Athena, sealed alive within sacred stone. Food is withheld, water denied. His punishment is starvation offered not to the people, but to the gods. His death, when it finally comes, is not swift. It is slow, agonizing, and sanctified. This was Sparta's cruelest theater. When the gods were invoked, execution became ritual sacrifice. Offending the state was one thing, offending the divine order was another. And in Sparta, the two were inseparable. To betray the city was to betray the gods who guarded it. To question tradition was to question the sacred itself. And the punishment was staged with a precision that blurred the line between religion and cruelty. At the shrine of Artemis Orthia, the same place where boys bled under whips for sport, victims could be bound to altars, displayed as offerings. Exposure was common. The condemned were tied, left in public view. sometimes for days without food or water. The sun burned their flesh by day, the cold froze their bones by night. Passers-by watched them weaken, their voices crack from thirst, until silence became the final prayer. Death was not immediate, it was spectacle, drawn out, witnessed by all, a living sermon of obedience. There is a chilling irony here. Temples, places we think of as sanctuaries, became prisons of torture. The very walls that should have offered protection became tombs. Imagine walking past your city's most sacred shrine, the place you're told embodies purity, and hearing the faint moans of a dying man inside. For Sparta, that was the point. Piety was not comfort. Piety was terror. This wasn't unique to Pausanias. Throughout Spartan history, those accused of sacrilege or treason often found themselves punished not just in public squares, but in holy spaces. The gods were enlisted as executioners, and the audience, the people of Sparta, were complicit, forced to watch, forced to learn, forced to accept that divine wrath could descend on anyone. The spectacle was designed to erase the boundary between state and religion. In Athens, blasphemy might lead to exile or fines. In Sparta, it meant your body became an offering. You weren't just punished, you were repurposed into a ritual. You ceased to be a man and became a warning, a bridge between mortal sin and divine retribution. And here's where it gets even darker. When the execution ended, the ritual often continued. Corpses were sometimes left exposed, denied proper burial rites. For the Greeks, this was no small cruelty. Burial meant passage to the afterlife, honor to the family, a place in memory. To be denied burial was to be denied identity itself. In Sparta, this denial was deliberate. The gods were given your body, but your soul was left wandering, dishonored, erased. This was execution as erasure, punishment that extended beyond death into eternity. And it reveals something profound about the Spartan psyche. They didn't just want to control your body, they wanted to control your legacy, your memory, your very soul. Modern parallels are disturbing. Think of authoritarian regimes that stage public confessions in front of cameras, not for justice but for humiliation. Think of trials where guilt is predetermined and punishment becomes theater. Sparta was there 2,000 years earlier, perfecting the art of turning punishment into spectacle, and spectacle into faith. And yet, as grotesque as ritual sacrifice was, it still paled compared to what they reserved for the ultimate crime. Because if blasphemers and adulterers could be tortured in the name of the gods, traitors, those who betrayed Sparta itself, were subjected to something even worse. For in Sparta, treason meant more than death. It meant annihilation, not just of your body, but of your name, your family, your place in history. There was one crime the Spartans feared more than cowardice, more than adultery, more than blasphemy: betrayal. To betray Sparta was not to simply break a law, it was to wound the body of the state itself, to drive a knife into the chest of the very community that worshipped discipline above all else. And for that, death alone was never enough. In Sparta, traitors faced something far worse than execution. They faced erasure. Imagine living in a world where your body could be destroyed, your family disgraced, and even your memory scrubbed from existence. That was the fate of those who dared turn against the city. Sometimes the punishment was brutally simple: stoning. The entire community, armed with rocks, gathered in judgment. Each stone hurled wasn't just a weapon, it was participation. The crowd became executioners, ensuring no one was innocent, no one was outside the act of vengeance. The condemned was battered into pulp, their body unrecognizable. It was messy, it was cruel, but that was the point. To betray Sparta meant to be torn apart by Sparta itself. Others were thrown into pits, literally cast down, broken, left to rot in the darkness. Animals picked at the remains. The earth itself became the executioner, swallowing the traitor into a grave unworthy of ritual or remembrance. Burial rites were denied, prayers forbidden, names stricken from records. In a culture that prized legacy above life, this was devastation. To a Spartan, being forgotten was worse than being killed. Take the fate of King Pausanias once again. Even after his agonizing death in the temple, Sparta wasn't satisfied. His body was dragged out, and though he was already dead, they mutilated him. Why? Because treason demanded more than life. It demanded desecration. His memory was poisoned, his family disgraced, his name forever marked as a warning. In Sparta, not even royal blood could protect you from the wrath of betrayal. And this is where the cruelty escalates into something almost unthinkable. The punishment didn't stop with the traitor. Families were often dragged into disgrace alongside them. Wives shamed, children branded with dishonor, property seized, reputations destroyed. One man's betrayal became a generational curse. Imagine being a child carrying a name that was erased from the city's rolls, treated as if you were already dead. That was the ripple effect of treason. But there was an even darker layer. Sometimes traitors were made examples long after their deaths, their stories twisted into cautionary tales, their disgrace woven into songs and sayings, their very existence reshaped into parables of horror. The state controlled not only how you lived and died, but how you were remembered or deliberately unremembered. It's chilling because this isn't just punishment of the body, it's punishment of the soul, the family and the memory. Modern parallels echo with disturbing clarity. Think of authoritarian regimes that disappear people, scrub their names from records, airbrush them from photographs, erase them from history books, as if they never existed. The Spartans pioneered this centuries earlier, turning erasure into an execution method of its own. This is what made the traitor's death the most feared of all. To be stoned, to be thrown into a pit, to be mutilated, these were horrors enough. But to have your memory obliterated, your family broken, your name spat on for generations, that was annihilation. And annihilation was Sparta's ultimate weapon. But here's the grotesque twist. Sparta didn't stop at killing its enemies or its traitors. It didn't even stop at humiliating adults. Sometimes, the role of executioner was handed to the next generation. Children, boys barely into adolescence, were made to participate in the violence, to absorb cruelty into their very bones. Because in Sparta, death wasn't just a punishment, it was an education. And the most disturbing lesson was this: even children were turned into killers. The sound of laughter echoes through the Spartan night. Not the laughter of joy, but of boys, barely teenagers, mocking the cries of a dying man. He writhes on the ground, struck down not by soldiers hardened with years of battle, but by children holding daggers. Each stab is awkward, unpracticed. But it doesn't matter. This isn't about efficiency. It's about education. And the lesson is as clear as blood on their hands. Cruelty is civic duty. From the moment Spartan boys entered the agoge, their training was steeped in violence. They were not simply taught to fight. They were taught to kill without hesitation, without compassion, and most disturbingly, often without consequence. Each year, the state declared ritual war on its enslaved helot population. A grotesque legal loophole that made slaughtering them not just acceptable, but encouraged, and who were often sent to carry out this legalized murder. Packs of Spartan youths crept into the countryside at night, knives in hand, hunting helots as if they were animals. Imagine a summer camp where the field trip was assassination. That was Sparta's idea of preparation. The goal was twofold. First, it kept the helots in constant terror, reminding them they were never safe, not even from children. Second, it hardened the boys, stripping away empathy before it could ever take root. To grow into a Spartan man, you had to first prove you could be a Spartan executioner. The cruelty wasn't limited to the countryside. In public, too, children were used as instruments of punishment. During rituals, They whipped their peers until blood ran down their backs, learning to deliver pain with precision. Sometimes they assisted in executions, holding ropes, jeering at the condemned, mocking their suffering as if rehearsing for adulthood. Each act of violence was another stitch in the fabric of obedience, sewing brutality into their very identity. What makes this so chilling is the normalization. These boys weren't treated as child soldiers reluctantly pressed into service. They were celebrated, rewarded, honored for their cruelty. To hesitate, to show pity, was to risk being labeled weak. And in Sparta, weakness was unforgivable. Imagine being 13 years old, knowing that mercy could cost you not just your honor, but your life. The emotional toll is impossible to calculate. Did some of these boys feel horror the first time they drove a blade into a helpless man? Probably, but horror was silenced by fear of ridicule, fear of shame, fear of becoming the next victim. Over time, hesitation hardened into habit. By adulthood, pity was gone. The cruelty that had once been shocking was now second nature. This was Sparta's greatest and most terrifying achievement. It didn't just enforce brutality, it reproduced it. Each generation was taught to carry the whip, the dagger, the stone. Violence was not an aberration, but a tradition, passed down like an heirloom, inherited with pride. Children were not shielded from the cruelty of their society. They were made complicit in it, architects of it, executioners within it. And the darkest part, this system worked, until it didn't. By raising its children in cruelty, Sparta guaranteed obedience, but it also guaranteed rigidity, a society incapable of empathy, flexibility, or change. The very lessons that made Spartan children killers also sowed the seeds of Sparta's eventual downfall. Because when a society educates its children to kill without question, it is not just executing its enemies, it is executing its own future.